The National Center on Improving Literacy presents an Ask an Expert video series, Vision Impairment and Dyslexia. We asked Marnay Lofton, retired psychologist from the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired, what are some of the factors that impact the development of reading skills in students with visual impairments?
Again, it's difficult to generalize because of the complexity of the population, but I think there's some general patterns that emerge. Just like students who have vision, the early experiences form the real basis for learning to read for children. That opportunity to listen to books, to sing the nursery rhymes that build those skills in recognizing rhymes. Experiences in the world where you're seeing the way that words are used, the importance of reading, all of those things form the basis. Sometimes children with a visual impairment have difficulty in acquiring that same set of experiences. Many of the early intervention programs that have been developed have really helped remediate some of those problems. But the typical child with a visual impairment is not going to encounter the words in their environment that encourage kids to read. More and more we're seeing Braille in the world, on elevators, on doors, etc. But it's not easy for children to look up and see a sign and recognize the letters and use that as identification. So they miss a lot of experiences unless intensive efforts are directed toward providing those types of experiences. The other thing, though, is that when you look at the actual development of reading skills, what you find is that there are very similar patterns for children who have visual impairments and children with normal vision. Particularly in the early stages of reading, you're going to have highly similar patterns of skills that develop. With phonemic awareness, with basic phonics, we can expect children with a visual impairment to be achieving at the very same level as their peers. There used to be urban legend, for want of a better word, that children who were Braille readers had difficulty with phonics. But a fairly comprehensive study that was just recently completed, the alphabetical Braille and contracted Braille study, followed a group of children who were Braille readers for the first 5 years of their educational career. And they found that these students were keeping up with their peers in terms of phonetic awareness and basic phonemic awareness. The only time that they seemed to have problems was when they looked at the final blends, and children who were Braille readers did have problems with that. They hypothesized that the problem with those final sounds was that it depends upon being able to see the lips of the speakers, and that was why they were falling behind. I think an even more telling study about the development of reading skills focuses on the brain imaging studies that have been done. With the brain imaging studies, we have been able to determine that the exact same areas of the brain that are activated when a child with vision starts to read are the same areas that are activated with a child who is a Braille reader begins to read. And this is the case even for children who have never had any vision. It's a fascinating result to me. The only difference between the brain imaging studies of children who are Braille readers and children with normal vision is that an area of the brain that is related to the somatosensory area is activated on Braille readers. So they are using the tactile portions of their brains more than a sighted child, which makes perfect sense when you consider it. So what we know is that developmentally and neurologically, the beginning stages of Braille are very, very similar for both sighted children and children with a visual impairment, which leads us to the conclusion that the differences that do arise, the problems with phonemic awareness, phonetical analysis that show up in young children who are Braille readers is the result of some of the issues that we look at with Braille. Now, when we do look at what are the differences, there are some significant differences between children who are visually impaired and children who are have normal vision. Again, one of the big ones is on that real initial level of experience. What is happening with these kids when they're starting to become interested in the printed or represented word? What is the difference? We know that the next time that there becomes significant problems with these kids is when you hit the point that children are reading to increase their fluency. And one of the unfortunate aspects of being a Braille reader or a low vision reader is that it is most typical that they're always going to be a slower reader. You know, the Braille reader has to make decisions based upon contextual information. So they may try one word and then have to try another one. So that will slow them down. And then the other thing is that tactile processing is simply a slower method of processing than visual. So those all result in slower fluency rate for the Braille reader. For the print reader, it's a little bit more subtle, and it's probably something that any evaluator will need to really communicate with the TBI to understand. These students are learning new methods of accessing their materials, you know, whether it's magnification, auditory materials, etc. So they're having to learn skills, which are going to slow them down, and they may never become as efficient. It may always impact their reading rates. The other thing is that we need to be very careful that we're not making a determination about dyslexia or reading disabilities on the basis of fluency. You know, those are things that are impacted by the visual impairment, and you need to have the input of the TBI to understand if this is a realistic fluency problem or if it's a function of their visual impairment. The final thing that you start seeing differences in as they get a little bit older, and we're talking primarily at about the 4th grade is where the differences started showing up. There's going to be a decrease in comprehension. I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because oftentimes we make false assumptions about children and their vocabularies who are visually impaired. It's almost a function of the echolalic speech that is an issue early on in life, in that we assume children have knowledge of a particular concept. And so as they get further along in their career, what we understand is that they don't have full comprehension. They may have bits and pieces, but sometimes they miss some of the critical pieces of information. Other times they miss the overall concept. So it's hard to build both vocabulary and comprehension when you're missing some of the basic concepts. And I think all of those things contribute to the differences between reading development. But in summary, I really want to stress that the early stages of reading for a child with vision and a child who is visually impaired are very similar. And difficulties there should always be reviewed in the context of, is there another coexisting condition?
This video is funded by a grant to the National Center on Improving Literacy from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education in partnership with the Office of Special Education Programs. Award number S283D1600003. The opinions or policies expressed are those of the authors and do not represent views of OESE, OSEP, or the U.S. Department of Education. You should not assume endorsement by the federal government. Copyright 2021, National Center on Improving Literacy.